Yes, welcome to the production here in San Mateo. We just concluded the morning session that was started off. Henry introduced our two first speakers. Our first speaker was Catherine Austin Fitts, and my gosh, very powerful take on the money system and the black budget and the black projects that is totally unbelievable. I mean, this woman has it down, and what we're seeing here is that years ago, Charlotte Littlefield and I, we interviewed a couple of brothers. I forget their names right off the bat, but they had a book out called The Scientific Dictatorship. And what we're seeing in today's world is something very akin to that. We're seeing something that's been created over a number of decades, and today is at an all-time high of organization and integration of many very, very powerful institutions and groups. We've got, later on, we've got Richard Dolan, we've got Joseph Farrell that's going to be back. Joseph P. Farrell and Carol Rosen are going to speak this afternoon. But getting back to Catherine Austin Fitts, she worked in government for a number of years, and eventually she began to acquire an understanding and an insight into black budgets and off-the-books types of operations and black operations and so forth. And she gave a very, very powerful speech. Much of this she related back to the 30s and brought it forward into modern times. I would have to add to what her view is that, and she would certainly agree, she's not here beside me right now. We're going to bring an author of Uprising of the Human Spirit on with us in just a few minutes. But I'm going to give a little bit of an update on the first two speakers this morning. We're at the Secret Space Project conference in San Mateo. We're broadcasting live. We're streaming live right now. And we'll be live for this remaining part of this hour from 12 to 1 o'clock Pacific Daylight Time. But like I said when I first started, Catherine Austin Fitts was the first speaker, and John Rappaport, my gosh, he talks about mind control and what we can do. But it's in such a very, very humorous way that it gets you laughing at times about this mentality of people just moping around and thinking that they can't ever really do anything to change the world. But much can be done by individuals. So we get back to Catherine Austin Fitts. What has happened in this country, especially starting in 1913, was a monopoly was created to take over our money system through the Federal Reserve System, which is privately owned. That is the same mechanism that is continuing and functioning to you could say, liquefy and keep liquid some very, very insolvent corporations and international financial corporations. The derivatives market resulted in many losses that resulted in the trading and the speculation in those kind of instruments. And as a result, what we have is a plethora of financial corporations that are not in very good shape. And some would maintain probably broke. So we're looking at these in the context of a modern state, financial state, that's trying to reorganize itself. So Catherine Austin Fitts' experience was she went back, and of course we've got the 1913. Later on, especially after World War II, we had an organization that popped up, and I believe the JFK assassination would be the best example of what went on. There was an integration, World War II. We've got Eric Williams Towle coming in with us, and he's going to sit down and talk about his new book. And anyway, we're going to get back to this update, but sitting next to me, who just joined me, is Eric Williams Toll, and he's the author. What's that, Toll? Toll, yeah, Eric Williams Toll, Towle, Eric Williams Toll, and he's the author of Uprising of the Human Spirit. And we're just going to let him tell a little bit about his background. And this is a gentleman I met yesterday at the conference that both of us are attending, and we're doing a live broadcast right now on the web. We're web streaming live to the internet and the audience. We've got a pretty good sized audience out there in most cases. But anyway, welcome to our program, Eric Williams Toll, and we want to especially welcome you in the context of this conference, and tell us a little bit about yourself, and then give us a little introduction on your book.
Well, hi, I'm glad to be speaking with you today. Well, I have been a student of the human condition for many, many years. There we go. I decided to study psychology some 20 years ago, and as a way of getting deeper into understanding why people behave the way they do. It's something that's always fascinated me, why there's seemingly so many answers to problems in the world, and yet people don't seem to really follow them. They tend to do the opposite often, and it seems confusing, and this is something that interested me. So I was a psychotherapist for a number of years. I dealt with a lot of really in the trenches kind of issues. I specialized in violence and aggression, and worked with people coming out of prisons, domestic violence cases, and child abuse and that sort of thing. Learned a lot about human beings and in desperate conditions. And what I came to realize after some time was that much of what happens to people in their lives, much of the turmoil that they create and the pain they create, is really something that is, for the most part, inspired by the world they're living in. We have a mental health system and a system of psychology in America, the official system, that is, that basically puts all the emphasis on the individual. If there's something wrong with you, then it's your problem. It's because something went wrong in your brain, or there's something wrong in your family, or there's something wrong particularly with you as an individual. And the system was designed that way, basically, to take the emphasis off of the larger system. Major foundations in America many years ago, the Rockefeller Foundation, Carnegie Foundation, Ford Foundation, these big entities that came out of the big fortunes that were produced after the Civil War, they began to shape society in a way that would support their power. And essentially, they began to shape the social sciences to underlie and support their power. And they really shaped academic and institutional psychology and social work to basically put all the emphasis on the individual, because they didn't want people looking at the larger system. They didn't want people asking to change the system because it was hurting people. So they just thought, well, if people are having problems, becoming neurotic or going crazy, it's their individual problem. It's not due to the way we're shaping society. But once you begin to work with people in any depth, you begin to realize that it's really the other way around. Our system is really set up in a way that creates mental illness. It pushes people into conditions where they end up abandoning themselves. They end up abandoning what's best in themselves to suit the larger structure of the power that rules us. So after working with people for a number of years and seeing that I couldn't really help people, I mean, you can always do some work with individuals to help them realize how to back out of the system that has sort of condemned them. But the larger answer is really, I began to feel was really had to do with changing our larger society and informing people that it's really the structure of the society we've built that's really generating most of the problems and the mental illness. So that's what led me to begin to do research on writing a book around that subject. And so what I did was look at the evolution of consciousness, which I believe is really at the basis of how society changes and grows. Societies really have a kind of arc that we're all familiar with. You know, civilizations rise and then they fall. We see this throughout history. You know, what became obvious to me in my study and research, consciousness really is what's driving the opening of new societies that really thrive for a time. You know, they say that all societies go, they start out and they grow to a golden age.
Just hold that in there.
Hold it in there, okay. They grow to a golden age, and what happens is that golden age really comes about because people are free to use their imaginations, as John Rappaport was just speaking about. The real emphasis that produces a healthy civilization comes out of the freedom of individuals that allows their unique genius, the potential of people to rise up out of the general public and to invent and to create a thriving society. What happens after a time is that there is a certain element within the society that rises to positions of power, and then basically they want to pull up the ladders at a certain point, and they want to institutionalize that power so that things will not change and they can continue to stay in power. Their heirs will continue to stay in power. And so the evolution of consciousness that's really driving society up from the bottom to greater and greater feats of wisdom and beauty begins to be shut off by the status quo, that begin to calcify the institutions into hardened forms that are not responsive to the public any longer, begin to enshrine their power. And so this real tension begins to develop between that rising consciousness of the individual and this society that's been locked down to reinforce the power of the status quo. And that's what my book is about, is living in that condition today.
Eric, you seem to draw upon a couple of different researchers. Carol Quigley, I think, is mentioned in there. Let me get this. Let's just take a minute break here. We've got to change out this microphone. Wait just a second. Okay, we're back now. I believe we've got a better microphone now. And we just had a bad mic there. We're going to continue with this. Like I was asking, Eric Williams Towle, T-O-W-L-E, is our guest this afternoon. Right after noon, what's concluded is a couple of speakers, Catherine Alston Fitz and then John Rappaport. He's written a book entitled Uprising of the Human Spirit, and I believe he drew on two main individuals in the past, Carol Quigley, and then there's a Gerbser. Is it Gebser? Yes. Gebser, yeah, Gebser. Could you explain a little bit of their experience and how you gained from their experience in their writings?
Sure. So, the two elements that I'm drawing from are the evolution of consciousness. And there, on the one side, I draw mainly from the German theorist Jean Gebser, who is really an undiscovered genius of the 20th century, a man who did this massive study of history and the products of culture to demonstrate that there is this evolving consciousness going on through time. On the other side of it, in studying the evolution of civilizations and the rise and fall of civilizations and the political power and dynamics around that, situation, I really drew from the work of Carroll Quigley. A lot of people in the circles that are familiar with the conference today know Carroll Quigley from his writings that have sort of revealed a lot of the power structure. But he also was he was a very famous professor who was studying the evolution of civilizations, and he taught at the Georgetown School of Public Service, and was somebody Bill Clinton talked about, and others. He was very well known, and his Quigley's analysis was just this very simple thing, that societies grow for a time because they create what he called instruments of civilization, that are institutions that essentially respond to people that are there to support the public, so that the genius of the public can rise up and create a great society. But what he said is that those instruments of civilization turn into these hardened institutions at a certain point. They calcify into these unresponsive structures that are not responsive to the public, and just want to, they're just there to support the people at the top of the pyramid. They're just there to essentially, reinforce the power of the status quo. And when that happens, you start to kill the goose that laid the golden egg, essentially. You begin to kill the creative function of the populace. And so various different problems start to arise. And Quigley basically talked about what happens to societies once they start to decline, the ways out of the problem, and the ways that basically lead to the final destruction. So,
I must say also, I've studied Carroll Quigley over the years also, and that money power was a really strong part of his book. And how does that affect our society today? Is this international financial system, is that a very dominant type of dynamic?
Well, sure. I mean, that's what it comes down to, is that systems thrive for a time because the genius of the people allows new, and the evolution of consciousness behind it. Consciousness opens up in the same way that children develop. Anybody who has kids knows, they start out with very little minds and capable of understanding very few simple things, and then as they grow, they become more and more sophisticated. So what happens over time is that the institutions that are developed by this thriving, expanding mind, the people within them begin to want to retain their power. And so they believe that they can create a better system from the top down than the people can create from the bottom up. And so this is the continuing problem through history. The people get shut down because that group at the top wants to retain their power and wants to run things according to what they think is their better ideas. And so, yes, the current situation with this sort of this transference to this larger sort of world government kind of idea that they've been pushing for a while is really an attempt to solidify this top-down control in a more global way. And of course, in the long run, history has shown us that these structures never last. They don't work because they shut down the very creativity that comes out of the populace. Once you start to regiment the populace to basically follow and support this elite, then the whole thing starts to crumble. It starts to deteriorate. So yeah, it is definitely related to that big money power.
When when I speak or write, I talk about a delusional state, and the way I define it is one that we do not have an accurate assessment of reality for one reason or another, either past learning, predisposed ideas, either education, there might be even religious ideas, but it keeps us sometimes from being able to perceive directly, I'm saying, or indirectly through others, a reality that is accurate. What would be your comments?
Well, yeah, so one of the ways that civilizations over time have basically fallen into this hardening process that leads to destruction is that as society, as consciousness has grown more complex in the evolutionary process, we have societies that have become more complex, and essentially the method for maintaining power has become more one that exercises what you'd call soft power as opposed to hard power. Hard power is sending, secret police and troops out to basically keep people in line, Soft power is when you try and convince them that your agenda is right, when you try to use propaganda as a way of getting them to just agree to coming along with you. And so that's the sophistication of that propaganda system has grown into really what you can describe as a false culture. It's a false culture that is erected by the status quo in order to support their power at every turn. So the problem with that is that this is what helps to generate mental illness in the public, is that real culture comes from the ground up. It comes out of the inspiration of the individual human spirit in community with other people who are experiencing that authentic expression of their humanity. That top-down imposed fake culture that comes out of the television and the political structure, the movie industry and all the rest of the culture industry, that creates an image of reality that doesn't actually jibe with what the person is feeling. So people feel this disjointedness, this kind of odd feeling like they don't fit in the world, like there's something wrong. They want to fit, they want to be accepted by people, so they play along with the false culture, but there's always this schism between their genuine being, their spirit, and this phony culture that's been imposed on them. So yeah, I think that ties in with what you're getting at.
The new technology that we have today, Twitter and all these other things, these social networks, Facebook, we've got Google in there, we've got, Google search, that was a big deal, still is. But how are they helping individuals communicate directly with one another? And like the Arab Spring, was that an example a little bit on the grassroots basis of an uprising that you might be describing or speaking to?
Well, yeah, the Arab Spring and these color revolutions, as they call them in the Middle East, they're using social networking tools to communicate outside of the mainstream avenues of control, and so they're using them to coordinate their revolutionary activities. I think there's some debate among some experts about whether they're being manipulated in some way to create revolutions that benefit other power groups. I think ultimately we have to be very careful about, the social media can be very helpful, but it's also an avenue through which people can be manipulated and controlled. So we always have to be on guard for how the status quo is going to turn things to their advantage. These are very sophisticated people that are engaged in controlling the populace, and so it really is something that they are constantly looking for. Any new thing that comes up, they're going to try and twist it to their advantage. So you've got to always be aware what's going on and make sure you're using these things in a clean way.
We talk about over the years, and I've done over 500 broadcasts, 100 webcasts live like this one this afternoon. But we talk about the public being asleep. Is there always a certain percentage of the population that will just not get keyed in or street smart to what's going on? And does it take a small number of people, a small percentage usually, to make real change happen, or what?
Yeah, sleep happens because people have to basically engage themselves in habitual behaviors to survive. We do habitual things all the time, and if we lived in a farming community and we grew our own food, we would do habitual things throughout the year in order to grow food and this sort of thing. And so it's easy to fall into these habitual patterns. There comes a time when things start to deteriorate because the status quo is running the system for their own benefit and not for the benefit of the people. So we're in this phase where everything's starting to deteriorate. The health insurance situation is a perfect example of how, it's just ridiculous. People are being raped by their insurance costs. Even the Obamacare ends up being a giveaway to the insurance and pharmaceutical industries. But what happens is that rising tension of the basic population not having their needs met reaches a point to where people can't sleep anymore. And so there's more and more people waking up all the time because their habitual patterns are being disrupted by these deteriorating conditions. So, yeah, I mean, once, people will tend to sleep until something happens in their life to wake them up. And then once they wake up, they begin to start to investigate things to reorient themselves with new information. So more and more people are doing that all the time. This is what the status quo, though, is trying to react to that and plaster people with more distraction. The Romans did this. The old saying about bread and circuses, speaks to this idea of, the Romans tried to control populations when conditions in Rome grew more and more desperate. They would throw bread to the poor people and spread, a form of welfare, and they would put on more chariot races, more gladiatorial games. And our society is in this phase. We're really throwing out the bread and circuses now because people are waking up. So,
very interesting. We've got this World Soccer, tournament down in Rio in Brazil. So I guess that's part of the games, isn't it? The Roman games. But something that's occurred to me over the years was the idea of social synergy, where it can operate on the dark, negative side or evil side, but it can also operate on a beautiful side, a very inspirational side. And so would the idea of social synergy, I should say, enter into some of your thoughts and expressions and writings?
Well, sure. I mean, synergy happens in a natural and healthy way when the inspired human spirit, the free mind in the individual, gets together with other free minds and begins to create that synergistic, greater than the sum of the parts kind of expression that produces new and interesting forms, new beautiful art, new beautiful technology, new beautiful breakthroughs in one field or another, or, just plain life. The synergy is important, and it is, there is a dark synergy that's used when the top-down control comes in and says, let's pull these people in over there and those people in, and they're always trying to put together their witch's brew of various people.
That's a good description of it. They practice sort of like a magic or a sorcery at times.
It's absolutely true. Yeah, they know a lot about how the mind works and about how reality is formed at certain deep levels of the power structure, I think. And so, sure, they try to put together that dark synergy, and they try to keep us from putting together our rising, public-supported synergy. So.
Well, those are some very good comments, and again, I want to reiterate, this is Eric Williams Toll, the author of Uprising of the Human Spirit, and on his book, you'll have to go there. You can get it at Amazon, and he'll tell you here in a website also probably you can get it. But the cover of the book has 3 strands of barbed wire, and one of the strands is broken with this figure. I guess it's a stick man figure, but in motion. And I thought that was very, very creative. Whoever did that came up with a tremendous book cover design, much better than I've seen in years on many of these books that are coming out. What would be some of your final comments here? We're going to be concluding this in about 5 minutes or so, but you've got 5 minutes and you've got the floor. And what other things did I miss? I miss things all the time. But you really explained the concept of your book and some of the insightful dynamics there that you put in this book. So I could very highly recommend my listening audience, and we're going to have him on our radio program out of Austin, Texas, The Secret Truth. .com in the near future also. But what closing comments would you have, Eric Williams Toll, about your book, or any ideas that you could add to what you've just said earlier?
Well, I think that one of the things that inspired me to write this book was that, I've been very interested in the work of Joseph Farrell and others who are presenting here at the conference. But the one thing that I see missing from much of the analysis is the understanding of the evolution of consciousness. The evolution of consciousness and how our consciousness has expanded, adding new structures over time, is an extremely important piece of the puzzle. So this is something to really take a look at, and my book helps put together that evolving consciousness and understanding how it works in you as an individual, and how the power structure it attempts to manipulate that evolution for their own purposes. So it gives some clues as to how to break out of that entrainment to the status quo and begin to create a new and better society by unleashing that individual unique potential out of your own evolving consciousness and those of your friends and neighbors. So that's really what it's about, is coming back to the individual and understanding how you hook up with others for a new type of community. But understanding something about your own evolving mind is really important in this whole question.
Eric Williams told what I like about your approach. It gets back to the individual. So you're saying that, boy, individuals have to take action themselves, and this gets away from this collective thing. I know, but are you saying that it takes individuals to change themselves to a certain degree, and then participate voluntarily with other individuals in a community of goodness or change? Is that sort of the idea, or what?
Yeah, I think you hit it right on there. That it's basically you in order to really understand how nature itself can produce a higher level civilization, a healthy civilization. You have to know how evolution is pushing you as a piece of that higher order civilization, and get together with others who are expressing their own authentic, deep self. And so that society that can come up through the individual in concert with others, in an honest expression of the human spirit, is the counterforce to the dark top-down system that attempts to basically enslave everyone into the projects of a few people at the top. So,
well, thank you very much for sitting down with us and discussing this. It's been very insightful. Again, that's Eric Williams Toll, Uprising of the Human Spirit. He's got a heck of a nice book design there. I don't know who did it, but they did him a good service there. But thank you again for sitting down with us. And we're at the Secret Space Program Conference in San Mateo. It's the second day, and we're going to have some additional speakers up next. But thank you very much, Eric.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to move on and give us some more updates here. We've got two more speakers coming on later this afternoon, actually three. We've got Richard Dolan that's up next at 1 o'clock Pacific Daylight Time. And also Robert. Yeah, we've got a man here that spoke. Yeah, come on over a second. Yeah. I've got a gentleman here that might join us for a second here, Robert Morningstar. Yeah, and he's going to sit down with us. Now, this guy, you talk about spirituality and individualism and so forth. Robert Morningstar is going to sit down with us just for a second, about 5 or 10 minutes, can you? Okay, and meant to get him earlier on. He spoke yesterday, but boy, he spoke eloquently, and he was on a panel discussion, and man, he made himself a presence there. And welcome to our program, Robert Morningstar. And boy, I tell you what, glad to meet you. I've read widely your writings on the web, and you're quite an individual. You're into spirituality. And tell our viewing audience a little bit about yourself, and then express any kind of ideas or opinions you would like.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to share a couple of ideas with you. My background: I'm a New Yorker. I've lived there 63 years. I went to Power Memorial Academy, Fordham University, where I was originally registered for pre-med, but I skipped the pre-med because I think
Thank goodness.
I skipped. I went from pre-med to real healing, which is psychology.
Yeah. Oh, I have a friend that was a great country artist, and he says, I didn't go to med school, but in country music he made millions. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was I saw where medicine was going, and I didn't really approve. And I really feel that all healing begins and ends in the mind. So heal the mind, That was my first idea. But then I became involved in Tai Chi Chuan and Chinese culture and philosophy and psychology. And Tai Chi is the oldest school of psychology on this planet, as far as I'm concerned. And it posits that sound mind and sound body is what the Romans said, mens sano in corpore sano. And the Chinese have this idea that when your mind becomes unbalanced, your body becomes unbalanced. Likewise, if your body becomes unbalanced, your mind is out of kilter. So here we treat the mind with drugs and therapies, psychoanalysis, and the Chinese say, well, you know, there is a perfect form for the human being, and when you deviate from that perfect alignment, the true self-image of the human being, you have problems that are both physical, emotional, and mental. So if you fix the body, realign it, your mind will be realigned and balanced. And it's really very mechanical, because it's just like taking your car to have a wheel alignment. When your wheels are out of line in your car, it doesn't steer correctly, it's dangerous in turns, it wears out the tires, and the fuel economy and efficiency go out the window. So and the analogy is that we align the bones of the body in a perfect alignment according to sacred geometry. And this is the geometry that was known to Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and it was an esoteric school of geometry, secret societies in the West. But in China, it was encapsulated in Tai Chi Chuan. And there's a long history of Tai Chi Chuan and relationship to the moon and legendary people. And so I've devoted my life to Tai Chi since the age of 23. And I'm very happy to have studied Tai Chi for more than 40 years. And very pleased to be here for this very special conference, Secret Space Program. And hope this...
Well, Robert, you're coming from a spiritual type background and so forth, and you're a great addition, I think. On the panel discussion, you would jump right in there and express your own opinions, which were very individualism. Tell us about some of those ideas.
Well, isn't individualism the essence of American?
I think so.
And I'm afraid that we lost that.
We've gotten in all this collective
right,
stuff.
Everybody's collective.
Have a group, right?
Yeah. No, really. When I grew up, I was taught that the greatest gift that we could give to the country was our own individual talents, unique ideas, forms of self-expression. But after the Kennedy assassination, a certain kind of conformity began to be enforced upon us. Conform to believe the Warren Commission report. And I said last night, the Warren Commission report is the most evil thing that ever happened to this country, because it perverted science, it perverted law. And the weight of witness it takes two people to gain a conviction in a federal court. And we had scores of witnesses who were all discredited, all dismissed, their testimonies changed. That was a perversion of law. The perversion of science came with the forcing true of the magic bullet theory, which was the brainchild of Arlen Specter and Gerald Ford. And people don't understand what I mean by that, but it means this. The wounds in the president's body were very specific, especially the back wound, which was between the shoulder blades and going downward. And Arlen Specter and Gerald Ford got a Navy corpsman to draw a rendering of the wound and move the position of the wound 8 inches up into the neck area to make their bogus theory plausible. And that, in the essence, is the perversion of science. And then it perverted medicine as well. Because what was done with the body of President Kennedy and the body and brain of Officer Tippit to force the Warren Commission conclusion to be true is utterly perverse. Folks, what happened in the Kennedy assassination is that Officer Tippit was the getaway vehicle. They killed Officer Tippit, who was a look-alike of President Kennedy, but the assassin put a bullet in his brain, entering the temple and hitting the top of the head. They took that brain and gave it to the autopsist, and that was the basis of the conclusion of the Warren Commission report, that quote unquote, President Kennedy was killed by a single bullet through the head. So there you have it in a nutshell. And it's a spiritual quest to get to the truth.
Right. What I really appreciate, Robert Morningstar, is your appreciation of individualism.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? We've gotten into sort of a mental state where we've got to do this together, collectives, whatever.
Well, that's Marxism. You see, there has been a slow incursion of Marxist-Leninist ideology that has slowly been disseminated through our society under the guise of community activism and a lot of other labels, and it depreciates the individual and extols the collective. But this is the basis of Marxist, Leninist history of Russia. There were no individuals in Russia. In the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe, people were forced to conform. And I'm a person who was fortunate enough to travel behind the Iron Curtain when the curtain was still up. I traveled to East Germany. I traveled to Yugoslavia, where I was followed by the KGB. I traveled to China, where I was followed by the KGB of China. Actually, the KGB of China are the tour guides. They keep an eye on everybody. Really, honestly.
That's the most efficient way, right?
That's honestly. And in Yugoslavia, I went there for 2 years, 1 year after another. And there I was being followed by a KGB agent, and I just turned around one day and went up to talk to him and said, "Hi, my name's Robert. How are you doing?" And then we became friends and we played a lot of chess.
That's gutsy, man.
Well, what could you do?
Yeah.
And it turned out to be a Yugoslavian member of their security forces, and I made his job easy. He had to keep the tail on me, so we went over to a restaurant, sat down, played chess for hours, philosophized, and we became very good friends, in fact. And then I was surprised when the Yugoslavian war came years later, because this man's name was Slobodan Milosevic, but it wasn't. It wasn't.
But it wasn't he.
It wasn't the one that was president. But how many could have been his nephew, his cousin? But
well,
that was a big surprise. Yes.
Well, I tell you. What.
So I know how that system works, and I crossed Checkpoint Charlie and went into East Germany, and folks. When I went from Berlin, which was Western culture, and crossed Checkpoint Charlie, I hesitated after I closed the door, and I said, well, maybe I don't really want to go. And I tried the door, and I was locked in. And then I was taken into a room, and I was held for an hour by 2 East German policewomen who went through everything in my wallet and looked at everything. And they got a little bent out of shape because I had a picture of my girlfriend. And when they saw, in a sexy pose, they looked at it and they kind of got shaken up, and they okay, you can go, and they rubber stamped me in. But when I went through Checkpoint Charlie, the world changed. I went into a totally gray, unhappy world. People were listless, had no motivation, despondency. In America, you go to a restaurant and the waiter does a good job, and he comes over and you give him a tip, and that's the way it is. There's no advancement in communism unless you're an apparatchik. And so everyone was listless, basically soulless. And the most memorable part of this trip was when I saw, standing on Alexanderplatz, I looked across the street and I saw all these dead light bulbs. But standing in the middle, waiting to cross the street, was an American Army captain. And in contrast, this man was radiating life, soul, happiness, in contrast to the dim light bulbs that were the communist slaves, basically. And I see that there's a slow encroachment of Marxist ideas, especially with this administration and their methodology for enforcing a certain kind of conformity. And I say, your individuality is the greatest thing that you can give this country. Express your opinions, defend your ideas, present them, defend them. If your ideas are correct and your facts are right, your ideas will be accepted. If your ideas are incorrect, your facts are wrong, you will be corrected, and you will be better for it, because everyone needs a course correction in life to get to where we're going. Otherwise, we never get there.
Well, Robert Morningstar, thank you very much, and we certainly do appreciate all those good insights, and the spirituality that you exude is just wonderful.
I thank you.
And we thank you very much for this interview. Any closing remarks?
I would just like to say the theme that I brought was that a breakaway civilization requires a breakaway consciousness, and there were three sayings I have. The truth is seamless. To think is to create. Imagination becomes reality. And with regard to the JFK assassination, I quote Sherlock Holmes. Once you have eliminated the impossible, whatsoever remains, however improbable, is the truth.
All right. Thank you very much, Robert Morningstar. We certainly appreciate the interview, and we wish you the best of luck, and we know you'll carry those good traits with you to other individuals.
I wish you and your audience, all of you, the same. We are the ones who are going to save this country. We are the ones that are going to educate this government.
I like that positive end note. Thank you very much, Robert Morningstar. We're sitting here, and we've just concluded an interview with Robert Morningstar. Man, the positive things that came out of there, that was just a wonderful interview, and it ended up on a very positive side. And that's sometimes we forget that we've got to get to the positive sometimes, and that positive can bring us out of this darkness, yes. There's a lot of negative things out here. There's a lot of institutions. There's the money problem. There's the political problem. They're cheating at the election box and so forth. But we can together, acting individually. I think Alexander Solzhenitsyn said it the best that anyone that I've ever seen. He said the battle line runs through everyone's human heart between the struggle for good versus evil. So he said the battle line between good and evil run through every human heart. And I think Robert Morningstar said it best there. He said we've got to act individually. It's a struggle within us. It's easy to externalize all of our problems in the world and just, dismiss our own shortcomings, our own failures, our own weaknesses. But if we start looking at ourselves, and this is where that saying, know thyself, is all important. We must start examining ourselves and the good, the ugly, and the bad, or whatever, however you want to say it. And we all have a good side and a bad side, a dark side, a light side, or whatever. But we must awaken to the way that we really are. I've always thought that in the past, when we were born, let's get back to that. I believe that there's a splitting off that occurs using a natural MPD type of dynamic. And I think what's operative is a multiple personality disorder that occurs naturally in that young baby. And then this splitting off is what could be described as a false self. And then the parents come in and unknowingly and unwittingly support and nurture and grow that false self. I think this is the beginning of trying to understand how we can come out of this really dark, predisposed way of being and begin to see ourselves as we should. I would add, know thy thoughts as a second good piece of advice, which means that we must begin to try to observe our thoughts as they're real-time unfolding and how those thoughts in many ways control us and keep us in a state of ignorance, really, and condition to negative things and not on the positive side. The third thing about know is know thy world, and that has a couple of levels. One level would be an interpersonal level where we must begin to understand and accept human nature as it really is and not hate or resent the way people are, and that includes ourselves. What we must do is we must begin to forgive, but the second level of that know thy world is about institutions, and I believe that Eric Williams Toll said it well, the author of Uprising of the Human Spirit, is that they'll try to institutionalize us through big organizations, big powerful organizations, operating to institutionalize us into a certain way of thinking, a certain way of being. And then my closing comments here, we're going to be getting back to our program in just a few minutes, and I'll tell you who's coming up next. But my final bit of wisdom or advice would be to begin to forgive yourself and others. Through forgiveness, we can break cults. We can break cults and out of cults, and we can become and move back to that real core, real self. The false self is an abstracted type of abstraction in many ways. It operates in the male, more the male ego state, and supports that than the female. So we as men must begin to see our part in a fallen society and come out of that. We must begin by forgiving ourselves and others. We want to thank you for viewing this live broadcast from San Mateo, the San Mateo Event Center. This is the second day of the Secret Space Program Conference, and we'll be concluding here later on at 9 o'clock Pacific Daylight Time. Coming up next is Richard Dolan, followed by James Farrell, and then Carol Rosen, and then we'll have a dinner break and a roundtable discussion later. We want to thank each and every one of you for viewing this live webcast presentation, and it's live on liveonlocation.tv, so come in there and support us in the future with our future broadcast. But thank you very much for viewing this, and we had a couple of fine guests during this noon break, and we're going to resume the program in about 8 minutes. Thank you very much for viewing this live presentation.